If you've never witnessed a grown man in pajama pants, bunny slippers, and a bathrobe standing on a tractor, shouting return to sender, while towing a massive concrete block, then you haven't truly experienced life. And if that man happens to be me, well, get ready, because the feud with the HOA didn't just start with petty squabbles. It began with a sneaky act of sabotage. The morning the drama kicked off felt like any other. Birds chirping, coffee brewing, and my dog Rufus barking at squirrels like it was his full-time job. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, already mentally preparing myself to tackle the annoying squeak in my front gate when something stopped me dead in my tracks. My driveway was blocked. Not literally missing, but effectively inaccessible. 3 huge concrete slabs now sat across it like the world's most uninviting welcome mat. They were ugly, gray, and looked like something you'd find on a military base, not a peaceful country road. At first, I thought maybe there was some road work or an emergency detour, but no. There was a smug little paper taped to one of the blocks. It was a violation notice from the HOA, scribbled in that curly, pompous handwriting by none other than Margaret Wright, the self-appointed queen of our neighborhood. She didn't go by her real name, of course. We all just called her the warden. The notice accused me of aesthetic misconduct for parking my vintage 1959 tractor too close to the road. Too close, in this case, meant 50 feet away, partially hidden behind a row of bushes and a tree I planted years ago. Never mind that I've lived here longer than the HOA has even existed. Never mind that the tractor is fully functional and likely more valuable than half the houses in the neighborhood. Margaret declared it a visual blight, and, without any warning, her little army of HOA enforcers had set up a concrete barrier to force me into compliance. I stood there, coffee in hand, feeling the ridiculousness of it all. This wasn't just petty, it was personal. Margaret and I had clashed before, particularly after I refused to attend one of her mandatory community improvement meetings and turned down her request for a donation to her husband's hopeless bid for the Save the Local Pond campaign. She'd always seen me as an eyesore, an affront to her pristine neighborhood, full of perfectly manicured lawns and overpriced statues. When I drove around the block to find another way into my property, I saw her standing at the edge of her perfect lawn, arms crossed, smiling like she'd just won a prize. She even waved at me, a smug, triumphant wave. That wave did something to me. It wasn't anger that hit me first. No, it was disbelief, mixed with an overwhelming desire for some good old-fashioned payback. That night, I called up my old friend Ben. He's a rancher and a notorious prankster. After I laid out the situation, he didn't laugh. He grinned. "You got a tractor, Tom?" he said. "Concrete doesn't float." And just like that, we were cooking up a plan, not just for revenge, but for a public spectacle that would make Margaret sweat and show the whole neighborhood how oppressive the HOA really was. The next morning, I dusted off the tractor, gave it a tune-up, and checked everything over. I made sure it was in perfect condition for the job. As I worked, neighbors stopped by, some pretending to walk their dogs, others just curious. I told them I was returning something that didn't belong to me. That evening, I hooked up a tow chain to one of the concrete blocks, revved up the tractor, and headed out. It wasn't fast, but it was loud, and it was deliberate. As I drove down the street, I saw lights flick on, people peeking through their windows, all watching the spectacle unfold. Margaret's lights were already off, but that was about to change. I reached the HOA office around 9 p.m. It was a tiny, converted building, nothing more than a former dentist's office tucked between a yoga studio and a frozen yogurt joint. I backed the tractor up, unhooked the chain, and carefully pushed the concrete block up against the office doors, just enough to block the entrance, but not enough to break anything. Then I taped a note to the block. Property returned. Next time, send a receipt. The following morning at 7:30 a.m., I got a text from Ben. Turn on Channel 6. I did, and there she was, Margaret, in a full business suit, pearls and all, arguing with a news crew outside the blocked office. "This is harassment," she snapped. "This is illegal." The reporter, with a smile, replied, "Were the barriers placed in front of Mr. Carter's house without a permit?" Margaret froze. Her face went red. I knew at that moment the battle had truly begun. But Margaret wasn't just going to roll over and accept defeat. She probably thought that embarrassing news clip would be the end of it. One viral video, a humiliating public moment, and I'd be satisfied. But no, that was just the beginning. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about my tractor. This was about every neighbor she'd bullied, every absurd fine she'd levied, every ridiculous rule she'd made up to tighten her grip on the community. This wasn't going to be a one-and-done revenge. This was going to be the slow, painful dismantling of her little empire. Ben came over the next morning, carrying a bag of donuts and a set of plans he'd printed from the county website. It was the layout of the HOA office, a tiny structure with no back doors, just 2 rooms and a bathroom. The best part? No security cameras. Margaret had obsessed over surveillance for the neighborhood, but had failed to protect her own headquarters. Classic. We spent the morning over coffee, planning our next move. By the end of breakfast, we had devised what Ben dubbed Operation Return to Sender. Phase 2. The plan was simple. I would deliver each remaining concrete block, one by one, to the HOA office slowly, deliberately, and without a trace of malice. Like a cat bringing home a bird, except the birds weighed 1,000 pounds and came with rebar. That afternoon, I prepped the second block. I cleaned it off, wrapped it in a red ribbon I'd saved from Christmas, and even printed a fake label that read, "To HOA Management," from a concerned neighbor. Ben and I laughed so hard at that, we almost dropped the chain. Sunday morning, just before their usual HOA meeting, I rolled out with the second block chained to the back of the tractor. This time, I dressed up, bow ties, suspenders, the whole 9 yards, just to add a little flair. As I drove down the street, I noticed a few neighbors waving, one even saluting. When I arrived at the HOA office, I backed the tractor up, the reverse beep echoing off the storefront. I placed a block right in front of the door and added a tiny garden gnome on top, holding a sign that said, "Enjoy." By the time Margaret showed up, she had to walk around the building just to reach the entrance, only to find it sealed tighter than Fort Knox. I stayed parked across the street, sipping from my thermos. She spotted me and stormed over, heels clicking sharply on the pavement. "This is harassment," she hissed. "You think you're clever? You're going to jail for this." I tipped my hat, smiled, and said, "Just returning property that was delivered to the wrong address. You can thank me later." Her face turned bright red. She stormed back to her car, pulled out her phone, and spent the next 15 minutes pacing and shouting into it. And that, my friends, was just the beginning. I didn't catch every word, but I heard tow truck, lawyer, and media spin more than once. Meanwhile, members of the HOA board began arriving, each one looking more confused than angry. Some of them were even trying to suppress smirks. It turns out, not everyone on her board agreed with Margaret's heavy-handed tactics, but they had been too scared or lazy to push back. As for the tow truck, it never showed up. Apparently, the driver saw where the block was located, on private commercial property, and bailed. Ben later confirmed that the local towing company wanted no part in the HOA drama after seeing the whole debacle unfold on the news. So, the concrete block stayed exactly where it was, and the HOA had to cancel their meeting because their office was blocked off. One of the board members, probably tired of keeping quiet, posted about it in the neighborhood group chat. The message included a laughing emoji and said, "Should have just asked the guy to move his tractor." That comment made my day. But Margaret wasn't one to admit defeat. The next day, a crew showed up at my place, buckets of construction adhesive in hand, determined to add another layer of concrete blocks. This time, I called the sheriff, but they moved quickly. By the time law enforcement showed up, the workers were gone, and the blocks were in place. I couldn't tow them now without damaging the driveway, but Margaret had made a huge mistake. She had escalated things publicly. Now, the whole neighborhood was watching, including people she definitely didn't want to attract. County inspectors, local reporters, and neighbors were coming out with their own horror stories. Fines for wind chimes, threats over flower bed colors, even ridiculous rules for Halloween decorations. It was as if the floodgates had opened, and the complaints started flooding in. That night, Ben and I set up wildlife cameras we'd hidden in birdhouses around my property. We were just in time, too. After midnight, a shadowy figure crept across my lawn, and try to loosen my mailbox post with a crowbar. The footage was grainy, but even under the hoodie and face mask, the distinct limp and stubby fingers gave it away. Margaret's husband. The next morning, I printed out the footage and mailed it straight to the sheriff's department. My next block delivery was already in the works. This time, I added a little extra flair, a homemade sign reading, "Your move," in bold yellow letters. As I hooked up the chain to the tractor, I couldn't help but feel a surprising rush of excitement. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just reacting to Margaret and the HOA's nonsense. I was taking control, one concrete block at a time. And I had a feeling Margaret was starting to realize that this wasn't going to end until I decided it was over. The next few days felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. The whole neighborhood was on edge, holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The HOA board was barely holding it together in public. Some members had gone radio silent, not wanting to be dragged down by Margaret. She, on the other hand, was becoming more and more erratic, driving faster, no longer waving at neighbors, and even seen yelling into a Bluetooth headset while storming through the local hardware store. Whatever she was planning, I could feel it brewing. The third concrete block sat at the end of my driveway, untouched. I hadn't moved it yet because I was waiting for the perfect moment. I wanted it to hit with impact, both theatrically and legally. Ben had been digging through county records and discovered a series of inconsistencies in how the HOA had been operating. Turns out, they never properly updated their bylaws when Margaret took over. Several of her recent actions, including the fines and restrictions she'd imposed, didn't meet the updated municipal guidelines, meaning they were all technically invalid. We finally had the leverage we needed, but just when we thought we were gaining some ground, Margaret played dirty. I came home one afternoon, after picking up some feed, to find my mailbox completely smashed. It wasn't just bent, it was obliterated. The pole was snapped clean in half, and the box itself looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. Worse yet, the cables for my exterior cameras had been neatly clipped right at the base where they fed into the main hub. I checked the footage from my backup wildlife cameras, the ones hidden in the birdhouses, and sure enough, there was the same figure again. Margaret's husband. Same hoodie, same unmistakable limp. This time, he even looked straight at one of the cameras, probably thinking it was a bird feeder. I filed another police report, this time with clearer evidence. The sheriff's deputy didn't say much, but when I handed him the SD card, his eyebrows shot up. He'd been watching the whole HOA drama unfold on the local news like everyone else in town, and I could tell he was enjoying the mess. He promised to issue a formal warning, but advised me to stay out of direct confrontation. That night, under the orange glow of the porch light, I decided it was time for the final act. No more waiting, no more pacing. The third block was going to be the centerpiece of spectacle. Ben, and I painted bright pink, a bold, obnoxious color that would make sure it stood out. On one side, we stenciled "Final Notice" in white block letters, and on the other side, we attached a small mirror. The idea was simple but brilliant. When Margaret looked at the block, she'd see herself in the reflection. The next morning, I made my move. I drove the tractor down the street with the final block chained to the back, rumbling like a freight train. As I approached the HOA office, kids waved from the sidewalk, and even parents slowed to watch the show. One guy across the street actually honked and gave me a thumbs up. I parked the tractor diagonally in front of the office and carefully unchained the block, easing it into place. It was now the third barrier blocking their entrance, and it was perfect. Margaret arrived 15 minutes later, and when she saw the block, she completely lost it. Completely lost it. She was red-faced, veins popping, and she was shouting at the block like it was somehow responsible for her problems. When that didn't work, she turned on me, yelling about harassment, civil suits, and federal obstruction laws. I didn't say a word, just smiled and sipped my coffee from the tractor seat. That's when Ben showed up, looking casual in a button-up shirt and carrying a manila envelope. He walked right over to her, handed her the envelope, and said, "Official notice. You're in violation of 3 county ordinances. Might want to read up on Chapter 16, subsection C." Margaret ripped open the envelope, her hands shaking, and scanned the first page. Her face turned ghostly pale. Ben had filed a formal cease and desist order, supported by documented evidence of procedural failures and overreach. The enclosed documents included statements from multiple neighbors, old meeting minutes, and even legal commentary from a former HOA attorney. Margaret stumbled back, muttering under her breath. Just then, the local news van, which had been tailing our little war for weeks, pulled up. A young reporter named Lindsay hopped out with a cameraman in tow. Perfect timing, Lindsay said, winking. Care to comment, Margaret? Margaret tried to dodge them, but Lindsay had developed a reputation for getting the story, whether people liked it or not. The microphone was shoved in her face, and Margaret finally snapped. This is character assassination. This man is a menace. He's using heavy machinery to terrorize me. Lindsay blinked and asked, You mean the tractor? Yes, that monstrous red thing. He's weaponizing agriculture. Margaret screeched. You could hear the cameraman chuckling behind the lens. Margaret stormed off, yelling into her phone, while the HOA board members trickled in, looking like kids forced to attend detention. One of them, Greg, a quiet guy who always kept to himself in meetings, walked up to me and muttered, For the record, I voted against the concrete. Then he scurried off, like he had just confessed to a crime. Later that afternoon, I found a note on my porch. No envelope, just a crumpled piece of printer paper. It read, This isn't over. You're going to regret this. Consider this a warning. It was typed and signed and poorly spell-checked. I handed it over to the sheriff's office along with the footage of the mailbox incident. Between the two, they agreed to put Margaret's husband under investigation for property damage and intimidation. Still, something told me Margaret wasn't done. People like her never go down quietly. They don't apologize, don't reflect, and don't back off until something bigger than their pride forces them to. But that was fine by me, because I had one more block, one more delivery, and a finale plan that would leave her legacy buried in the very concrete she tried to bury me with. When it landed, everyone would see it coming, especially Margaret. I attached a laminated copy of Margaret's original violation notice, the very first one that set this whole chain of events in motion. We added a bright red bow for a little flair and mounted it on a wheeled platform made from an old wagon base. I wasn't about to drive it in with the tractor. That would be too risky, too many eyes, but rolling it in by hand, that I could do with some old-fashioned muscle and a grin. On the morning of the HOA meeting, I dressed as if I was heading to church. Clean jeans, a pressed flannel, and polished boots. Ben, always the character, wore his best cowboy hat and carried a clipboard just for effect. We showed up 5 minutes before the meeting started, the concrete block in tow. It sat heavy and imposing on the platform, looking less like construction material and more like a mysterious, cursed monolith. People fell silent as we rolled it through the parking lot. Phones came out, but no one said a word to stop us. Most people were too curious to intervene, and a few were clearly enjoying the show. Inside, the HOA office was already filling up. The folding chairs were arranged in tight rows, with a folding table at the front, complete with bottled water, nameplates, and that ridiculous faux gold gavel that Margaret loved to slam whenever she called a meeting to order. Margaret hadn't arrived yet, which worked in our favor. We parked the block directly in front of the table, right at the center of the room. Then we sat in the front row, arms folded like two proud dads at a school play. A few board members recognized us. Greg, the quiet one, offered a nervous wave. The others either looked away or pretended not to notice. Margaret arrived 5 minutes late, flanked by her husband and a woman in a pinstripe suit who screamed high-priced lawyer without saying a word. Margaret froze when she saw the block. Her jaw tightened, and her cheeks flushed. For a second, I thought she might faint, but instead, she squared her shoulders and powered through, trying to pretend it wasn't there. She slammed the gavel down, cleared her throat, and announced, "This meeting is now in session. I will remind everyone that disruption or interference will not be tolerated, and legal counsel is present for any necessary enforcement." I raised my hand before she could finish. She sighed, visibly irritated. "What?" she snapped. I stood up slowly. Just wanted to point out that, according to HOA Bylaw 3.2b2b, all items affecting the agenda must be submitted in writing 72 hours prior to the meeting. However, this particular item, I gestured to the block, has been part of ongoing business since the last 3 deliveries. By my math, it qualifies. Laughter erupted around the room. Even the lawyer's lips twitched. Margaret was losing her grip, and everyone could see it. She tried to shift the conversation to new business, attempting to push through a motion to clarify acceptable use of private vehicles and heavy equipment on residential properties. It was a thinly veiled jab at me, but it flopped. None of the board members would second the motion. Greg, the quiet one, stood up next. He quietly read a statement he'd prepared, expressing concerns about how decisions had been made without votes, how fines were issued inconsistently, and how Margaret had overstepped her authority. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was a dagger straight to the heart of her power. Then came the final blow. Ben stood up with his clipboard in hand and read a legal notice from the county, confirming that the HOA was under formal investigation for multiple violations, including mismanagement of funds, improper notice on fines, and failure to adhere to updated municipal codes. The room fell dead silent. Margaret's face turned to stone, and her lawyer whispered something in her ear. Margaret nodded stiffly and then, in a cold voice, announced that she would be stepping down as president pending resolution of the investigation. The room erupted in polite applause. Not a cheer, but a slow, quiet release of years of pent-up frustration. Margaret stood frozen, furious, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. She grabbed her bag, turned on her heel, and stormed out without another word. Outside, the sun was high and hot. A few neighbors had gathered in the parking lot to watch her departure, some waving, others not even looking her way. As she pulled out, the wheeled platform holding the final block sat in the parking space closest to the office, pink and proud. Margaret didn't even glance at it. Ben leaned over and whispered, "That went better than I thought." I chuckled and replied, "I think she finally got the message." And just like that, the power shifted, not just from Margaret to someone else, but from fear to laughter, from control to community. The block remained there for the rest of the day. By evening, someone had placed a tiny flag on top that read, "Long live the tractor." I didn't put it there, but I appreciated the sentiment. The days that followed felt different in Timber Ridge. For the first time in years, neighbors chatted in driveways without glancing over their shoulders. Kids rode bikes past the HOA office without being told to stay off the grass. Wind chimes jingled freely from porches, and no one received a letter telling them their decorations were distracting. It was like a thick fog had lifted, and people remembered they were a community, not just a collection of people living under the same roof. The concrete blocks remained for a while like little monuments to resistance. The pink one with the final notice sign drew the most attention. Neighbors took pictures with it, left little gifts like a garden gnome in a hard hat or a cup of coffee sitting perfectly on its flat surface. I didn't move them. They'd earned their place in local history. Margaret, on the other hand, disappeared. Not in the literal sense. Her house was still there, her husband's beat-up SUV still parked in the driveway now and then, but she didn't show her face around the neighborhood anymore. Rumor had it she'd taken an extended leave of absence from her real estate job, retreating somewhere with less confrontation. Others said she was plotting legal retaliation, but nothing ever came of it. Probably because the investigation into her misuse of HOA funds and intimidation tactics had gotten very, very real. The county had all the evidence it needed: Greg's statement, the stack of resident complaints, and the footage of her husband tampering with my mailbox. No lawsuits came my way, just silence. Eventually, the HOA as we knew it dissolved. Officially, it was restructured. Unofficially, it was gutted and rebuilt from the ground up. A new committee was formed, one with actual elections, term limits, and, shockingly, respect for residents' rights. Greg was appointed interim chair until the fall and asked me more than once to join the new board. I declined every time, not because I didn't care, but because I'd already fought the fight I needed to. I didn't want a seat at the table. I just wanted to make sure the table didn't crush people underneath it. With the power vacuum gone, life finally started to feel like mine again. I repainted the old tractor, gave her a new seat, polished the chrome, and even mounted a small plaque on the side that read HOA Express. Every Sunday, when I rolled her out, people would wave or give me a thumbs up. One kid even asked if he could take a photo sitting on it, and I obliged. Ben joked that we should start offering tractor tours and charge admission. I told him we might just break even if we sold commemorative cinder blocks. A month later, I held a barbecue. Not a protest, not a rally, just good food, cold drinks, and neighbors getting to know each other again. I set up long tables in the yard, covered in mismatched tablecloths and bowls of homemade potato salad. Folks brought pies, casseroles, coleslaw, and more desserts than we had room for. Someone even brought a karaoke machine, which ended with a very enthusiastic but deeply off-key rendition of Sweet Caroline from Ben that will never let him live down. As the sun set and the fireflies came out, people started asking questions. Not about the HOA, not about Margaret, but about me, about the tractor, about why I fought back the way I did. And all I could say was this: sometimes the only thing standing between you and a life of quiet misery is a bit of nerve and a reliable tow chain. A few weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, just my name written in careful cursive. I opened it on the porch with Duke lying at my feet. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No threats, no fines, just a handwritten note. You made your point. I hope you're satisfied. I won't forget any of it. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need it to be. I folded the letter and dropped it straight into the trash. Satisfaction didn't come from winning. It came from knowing that I'd stood my ground and didn't let someone walk all over me just because they had a clipboard and a loud voice. Life found a new rhythm. The yard was finally mine again. I built a small wildflower garden where the last concrete block had been dumped, the one I never even had to move. Bees came, then butterflies. Eventually, birds started visiting, and I mounted one of the birdhouse cameras nearby to keep an eye on them just for fun. The mailbox got rebuilt, thicker, taller, reinforced with a steel core, just in case anyone got any ideas. I didn't expect trouble, but I'd learned it's always better to be prepared. Ben and I still met every week, usually over coffee or barbecue, depending on the day. Sometimes we talked about the HOA saga, and other times we didn't mention it at all. He had his own tales of fence disputes and chicken-related neighborhood wars, and I never got tired of hearing them. We'd become unlikely folk heroes, I guess, two stubborn old men with a sense of humor and a deep dislike for being pushed around. But if that was our reputation, I was fine with it. I wasn't trying to change the world. I wasn't out to start a revolution. I just wanted to be left alone to live my life without someone measuring my grass or telling me my tractor was an eyesore. Turns out, a lot of people wanted the same thing. All it took was someone to push back loud enough for the silence to break. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and pink, I sat on the porch with Duke, watching the fireflies spark to life across the lawn. The tractor sat in the distance, glinting in the fading light, still and strong. And as I sipped my iced tea, I couldn't help but smile. Some folks build fences to keep the world out. Others build walls to control what's inside. Me, I move concrete, one block at a time.